He wrote to a matchmaking agency with one demand: send him an ugly wife. Not kind, not clever, not hardworking. Ugly. Gideon Mercer had loved a beautiful woman once, and she'd walked away without looking back. So when loneliness finally drove him to seek a partner, he figured he'd outsmart heartbreak the only way a stubborn man could: eliminate the threat entirely. The agency sent him Rosalind Vale, and when she stepped off that train in the February cold, Gideon Mercer felt his entire plan collapse. Because Rosalind Vale was the most striking woman he had ever seen. If you've ever been afraid of wanting something too much, stay with me until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter took Gideon 4 days to write. Not because he struggled with words. He'd always been decent enough with a pen, had kept ledgers for the ranch since he was 19, but because every time he got close to finishing it, he'd read it back to himself and feel something between shame and stubbornness rise up in his chest, and he'd fold the paper and shove it under the coffee tin on the mantel and go back to whatever work was waiting. There was always work waiting. That was the one reliable thing about the Mercer Ranch. It was February of 1881, and the Nebraska Territory had been punishing since October. The kind of winter that didn't announce itself with one big storm, but just settled in and refused to leave, gray and grinding, wearing everything down slow. The creek that ran along the south pasture had frozen solid by mid-November. 2 of his hired hands had quit before Christmas, one to follow his brother to Colorado, the other just gone one morning without explanation, his bunk empty and his wages collected the week prior. Gideon hadn't replaced them. He kept telling himself he would, come spring. He kept telling himself a lot of things. On the 4th night, he finished the letter. I am a rancher, 37 years of age, in good health, with a working property of 460 acres in Calhoun County, Nebraska Territory. I am not a man of refined tastes or gentle conversation. I work hard and expect the same of those around me. I am seeking a wife who is practical, capable, and plain in appearance. I have no interest in beauty. I require a woman who will not be restless, who will not be looking elsewhere, who will work beside me and remain. If your agency can locate such a woman, I am prepared to correspond. He signed it, folded it, addressed it to the Hartwell Matrimonial Agency in St. Louis, Missouri, whose advertisement he'd clipped from a 2-month-old newspaper someone had left at the feed store. He mailed it before he could change his mind. People in Calhoun County knew Gideon Mercer the way you know a piece of land that's been there longer than you can remember. He was part of the landscape, big through the shoulders, broad-faced, with hands that were permanently calloused and a jaw that hadn't been clean-shaved since sometime in the previous decade. He didn't talk much at town meetings, didn't drink at the saloon on Friday nights the way some of the other ranchers did, didn't involve himself in other people's disputes. What people knew about him mostly was the ranch. 460 acres his father had staked in 1857 when Gideon was 13 years old and the territory was still raw enough to kill you 8 different ways before breakfast. His father had died of a fever in 1869. His mother 2 years after that. Gideon had run the operation alone since he was 25, building it up some years and just holding on in others, the way ranching went. What people did not know about Gideon Mercer, because he had never told anyone and had no intention of starting, was Margaret Hollis. He had loved Margaret Hollis when he was 28. She had come to the territory with her family. Her father was a land speculator out of Omaha, and she was the kind of woman whose appearance in a room changed the quality of the air. Not exaggerated beauty, not theatrical, just genuinely striking in the way that made men straighten up without knowing why. She had laughed easily and talked easily, and seemed to Gideon, who did neither of those things without effort, like something from a different world that had briefly landed on his. They had kept company for 8 months. He had believed, with the particular certainty of a man who doesn't give his feelings easily, that he was going to marry her. Then her father secured a deal with a cattle operation out of Cheyenne, and Margaret left with the family. And 3 months after that, Gideon received a polite letter informing him that she had married the son of the Cheyenne operation, a man with considerably more land, considerably more money, and Gideon had no doubt considerably better prospects. He'd read that letter once, then he'd fed it to the stove. That had been 9 years ago. He hadn't permitted himself to think about it in any sustained way since then. What he'd permitted himself, without quite acknowledging it, was a slow calcification, a hardening of certain beliefs that had settled into his thinking the way old scar tissue settles into a joint. You stop noticing it's there. You just move differently. He believed now that beauty was a kind of restlessness, that a woman who drew that sort of attention would always be aware of her options in a way that a plainer woman simply wouldn't. He wasn't proud of this reasoning, but he believed it with the quiet stubbornness of a man who'd been burned once and had spent 9 years constructing an explanation. The letter to the Hartwell agency was, in his mind, not a defeat. It was strategy. The response came 6 weeks later. He was in the barn when the boy from the post office rode up, and he took the envelope without much ceremony, finished what he was doing with the feed situation in the east stall, and then sat on an overturned bucket near the barn door to read it. The agency had found him a candidate. Her name was Rosalind Vale, 31 years old, from Hannibal, Missouri. The letter from the agency described her in terms that Gideon had specifically requested: practical, of modest appearance, accustomed to hard work. She had grown up on a farm. She had experience with livestock, with preserving, with the management of a working household. She was, the agency emphasized, a serious and capable woman, not given to sentiment or impracticality. There was a photograph enclosed. It was the small, slightly blurred kind that traveling photographers produced, taken in a formal studio somewhere. The woman in it wore a dark dress, her hair pinned back severely, her expression the flat, composed look that people assumed for photographs in those days, because holding still for that long while trying to look natural produced exactly this result. Gideon studied it. She looked in the photograph precisely as advertised: solid, plain, unremarkable. He wrote back the same evening, initiating correspondence. They exchanged 7 letters over the following 2 months. Rosalind Vale wrote the way she apparently did everything, directly and without embellishment. Her letters were not warm, exactly, but they were honest. She described her situation plainly. Her parents had died within a year of each other, leaving her the farm, which she had subsequently sold because she couldn't manage it alone and didn't have the resources to hire adequate help. She was living with her aunt in Hannibal and had been for 2 years. She had worked as a seamstress and as a bookkeeper for a dry goods operation. She was not, she wrote, looking for poetry or grand promises. I'm looking for a situation that is honest and a man who means what he says. Gideon respected that. He wrote back in kind, straightforward descriptions of the ranch, its current state, what would be required of a wife in his situation. He did not try to make it sound appealing beyond what it was. In her 5th letter, she asked him something unexpected. Why plain? The agency indicated you specified this. I am asking directly because I find roundabout conversation wasteful. Was it a practical consideration or something else? He sat with that question for 3 days before answering. Something else, he finally wrote. I will explain if you come. She wrote back, all right. The arrangements were made. She would arrive at the Calhoun County train station on the 15th of April. He did not sleep well the night before. This annoyed him. He was a man who slept well in almost all circumstances. Storms, financial pressure, the general difficulties of running a ranch alone, because he'd long since learned that lying awake didn't improve any situation. But the night of the 14th, he found himself at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, staring at the lamp flame and feeling something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't excitement. He wasn't sure he still had that particular gear. It was closer to the feeling before a significant transaction, the purchase of a large parcel of land, or the decision to sell off half your herd. Something that could not be undone once done. He drove the wagon into town the next morning. It was mid-April, and the territory had finally released its grip on winter. The ground was soft, the creek running again, the air carrying the first actual warmth of the year. He noticed these things the way you notice them when you're trying not to think about something else. The train was 20 minutes late, which gave him time to stand on the platform with his hat in his hands and feel increasingly foolish. There were 4 or 5 other people waiting, a merchant, a woman with 2 small children, a couple of men he recognized from the county but didn't know well. He stood apart from them. He was good at standing apart. He heard the train before he saw it. The platform trembled slightly under his boots. Then the engine came around the long curve past the grain elevator, and the squeal of the brakes, and the great exhaling hiss of steam as it slowed and then it stopped, and the door of the passenger car opened, and people began to step down. He watched the door. He saw her before she saw him. She was the third person off the car, carrying a travel bag in one hand and a smaller case in the other, stepping down onto the platform with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. She was wearing a blue traveling dress that had seen some use, her dark hair pinned back under a plain hat, and she was looking along the platform in that particular way of a person searching for a face they'd never seen. Gideon Mercer stood completely still. The photograph had lied. Not deliberately. Photographs always lied, really. They flattened things. But the effect of seeing this woman in full daylight, in motion, with color in her cheeks from the journey and eyes that were a sharp, clear gray that he hadn't expected, was nothing like the impression he'd been carrying for 2 months. Rosalind Vale was not plain. He searched for the right internal phrasing and failed to find anything that didn't feel ridiculous. She was not what he had asked for. He watched her scan the platform a second time, and then her gaze landed on him and stopped. He must have matched whatever description the agency had provided. She walked toward him with an unhurried directness, set her bags down a few feet away, and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "Mr. Mercer." "Miss Vale," he said. There was a brief, assessing silence. "You look," she said, "like a man who's just received unexpected news." He was not a man who was easily embarrassed. He felt the back of his neck get warm. "You don't match the photograph," he said. She looked at him steadily. "The photograph was 3 years old, and the agency wrote the description, not me." A beat. "Are you going to say it was deception?" "I'm deciding." "Well," she said, "while you're deciding, I'd appreciate if you could help with the trunk. It should be coming off in a moment." He helped with the trunk. They rode back to the ranch largely in silence, which he suspected suited them both. He'd prepared the house as well as he knew how, which meant it was clean and functional and not particularly welcoming, because Gideon had never put much stock in welcoming and didn't know how to fake it convincingly. There was a room for her, with a good mattress and a chest of drawers. There was food in the larder. The kitchen was serviceable. She walked through this house without commenting, looked out the window at the south pasture and then the east, turned around and looked at the state of the main room. "You have a systematic problem with your storage," she said. "How long has that corner been collecting gear that belongs in the barn?" "Years," he admitted. She nodded as though this confirmed something she'd suspected. Dinner that first evening was a negotiation of a kind, not unfriendly, but careful. She had cooked, efficiently and without making a production of it, a meal that was considerably better than what he'd been eating for years. He wasn't sure how to acknowledge this without sounding surprised, so he ate it and said it was good. She said thank you in a way that indicated she already knew. "I want to ask you something," she said, after the dishes were cleared. "All right. The letter. The one you sent to the agency, the specific request." She looked at him directly. "Was it because of a woman?" He didn't answer immediately. "You don't have to tell me tonight," she said. "But I'm going to ask again eventually. I find it's easier to know what you're dealing with." "It was because of a woman," he said. "A long time ago." "Did she leave?" "Yes." "For someone better off?" He looked at her. "How did you—" "Because that's the only reason a man decides what you decided." She stood up and began hanging her apron on the hook near the door. "I'm not her, Mr. Mercer. I need you to understand that I know the difference between my own life and someone else's, and I'll thank you to know it too." He had no answer for that. He wasn't sure one was required. "Good night," she said, and went to her room. The first week, Gideon waited for the other shoe to drop. He watched her the way you watch a newcomer in a situation that requires trust, not with hostility, but with a suspended judgment, a keeping of the ledger. He noticed everything. How she was up before him most mornings, already in the kitchen by the time he came in from the early chores. How she moved through the barn without hesitation, handling the horses without the usual hesitation of someone unused to them. How she walked the entire property on day 3, alone, spending 2 hours covering every acre of it, and came back with a list. An actual list, written in a small, precise hand in a notebook she apparently kept in her apron pocket. "The north fence line has 6 sections that need replacing before summer," she told him at dinner. "The water trough in the east pasture has a crack. It's losing maybe a quarter of what you're putting in each day. The grain storage has a moisture problem in the northeast corner, and whoever is managing your records hasn't updated the livestock count correctly. You're showing 4 more head than you currently have." He stared at her. "I can fix the records tonight if you give me access to the ledger." "How do you know about the livestock count?" "I counted." "You walked every field today?" "Yes." "In one afternoon?" "I walked quickly." She opened her notebook. "Also, 3 of your fences on the south side are being undermined by prairie dog activity. I found 4 active colonies. If you leave it, you'll have a horse with a broken leg before fall." Gideon put down his fork. He tried to recall the last time he'd done a full property assessment of that kind. He couldn't. "Why?" he asked. She looked up. "Why what?" "Why take the time to walk the whole thing? You've been here 3 days." She seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because it needed doing," she said. "And because if I'm going to live here, I need to know what the place is. I can't manage what I can't see." He didn't know what to say to that either. He handed her the ledger. By the second week, the corner in the main room that had accumulated years of deferred work was clean. The tools that had been drifting between the house and barn had been sorted and returned. The kitchen had been reorganized in a way that Gideon didn't initially understand, and then, once he did, couldn't imagine having done differently. She fixed the crack in the east trough herself, with a patch kit she found in the tool shed, and apparently knew how to use. He came back from the far pasture one afternoon to find her on her knees in the dirt next to it, working with a thoroughness and complete absence of self-consciousness that he found, unexpectedly, difficult to look away from. He stood watching for a moment before she noticed him. "It'll hold for a season," she said, sitting back on her heels and assessing her work. "You'll want to replace the whole trough next winter when it's less critical." "That's a year's warning," he said. "I find year's warnings useful." She stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at him. "The fence work is going to take about 4 days. Do you have a third person I can use, or is it the 2 of us?" "2 of us," he said. "I'll get wire from town on Thursday." "Get extra," she said. "The east section is worse than I initially noted." He got extra. What? The thing Gideon had not prepared for was the fact that other people noticed. His nearest neighbor, a man named Ott, who ran sheep on the property adjoining to the north, rode over on the second Friday to introduce himself, which in this part of the territory meant he was curious about the new wife and had decided that 2 weeks was sufficient patience. He arrived in the late afternoon, sat in the yard talking to Gideon with the particular casualness of a man who was actually paying attention to something else, and that something else was Rosalind, who was in the side yard stacking repaired fence posts and paying no apparent attention to either of them. "She's capable," Ott said, in the mild tone men used in that time and place when they meant something stronger. "She is," Gideon said. Ott watched her for another moment. "Agency match?" "Yes." Ott nodded slowly. "Hartwell Agency, up in St. Louis, sent the Gruber boy a woman 3 years back. That didn't take." He watched Rosalind lift 2 fence posts that Gideon would have handled one at a time. "This seems different." Gideon said nothing. He was watching too. 2 days later, a woman from the county named Mrs. Pickard rode over with a covered dish, which was the local idiom for, "I want to see the new wife." She and Rosalind sat in the kitchen for an hour while Gideon did careful work in the barn that did not actually require his presence in the barn. When Mrs. Pickard left, she gave Rosalind a prolonged look of assessment and said, "You'll do well here," which was, for Mrs. Pickard, an extraordinary endorsement. "She's intimidating," Rosalind told him at dinner, with what he was beginning to recognize as her version of amusement, which was a very slight change in the set of her mouth that someone who wasn't paying attention would miss entirely. "Most people think that," he said. "She's not, though. She's just direct." A pause. "We're alike in that way, I think." "The county will be relieved," Gideon said, and she actually laughed. A real one, brief and unguarded. And he found that it did something to the air in the room that he couldn't account for. 3 weeks in, he was beginning to understand that his plan had a flaw. His plan had been based on a specific theory, that a woman of modest appearance would not attract attention, would not have options, would not be restless. What he had not accounted for was that Rosalind Vale attracted attention regardless of how she looked, Because the quality that made her noticeable had nothing to do with her face or her figure. It was the way she moved through a problem, the way she saw what needed doing before most people would have identified that anything needed doing at all, the way she said difficult things plainly, without cruelty and without apology. Men noticed this. The farrier who came in the third week stayed an extra 20 minutes talking to her about the condition of two of the horses and left looking like he'd enjoyed himself more than he had any business doing on a working call. A young man from one of the neighboring operations came for a fence consultation with Ott and spent a visible amount of time looking in the direction of the Mercer yard. Gideon noticed this too. He noticed it with a tightness in his chest that he recognized distantly and uncomfortably as jealousy, which was a feeling he had not experienced since he was 28 years old and had promised himself, after Margaret Hollis, that he was finished with. He did not know what to do with this. He put it aside the way he put aside other inconvenient things and went back to work. Say, the problem was that she was there every evening, not in an intrusive way. She didn't demand conversation, didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. They had settled into a kind of rhythm that suited them both. Dinner, and then the evening chores, and then the lamp in the main room, she with her mending or her accounts, he with the ranch ledger or the week's correspondence. Comfortable, in the way that two people who are built similarly can be comfortable with each other without having established anything. Except that it was not exactly comfortable, not for Gideon, because he had started, somewhere in the third week, to look forward to the evenings. He hadn't looked forward to an evening in 9 years. One night, late April, a cold snap had come through after dinner, and they'd stayed at the table longer than usual. She was writing a letter to her aunt in Hannibal. He was supposed to be doing the accounts, but had instead been doing a mediocre job of not watching her write. "You're not working," she said without looking up. "Thinking," he said. "About what?" He considered lying. He wasn't good at lying, and she would notice. "About the original letter," he said, "the request I made." Now she looked up. "You asked me to explain," he said, "back in the first week. About the woman." "I did." He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "Her name was Margaret Hollis. We kept company for 8 months. I believed it was going to be permanent." A pause. She left when a better option appeared. Rosalind was quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet. She waited the way people wait when they know there's more. "I decided," he said, "that beauty was a liability. That a woman who attracted attention would always be aware that there was something better available." He could hear how it sounded, saying it out loud. "I know how that reads." "It reads like a man who made a rule based on one experience," she said, without particular judgment. "It does. You thought if I was plain enough, I wouldn't have options." "Yes." She was quiet again for a moment, and he could see her turning something over. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes." "I told the agency to describe me as plain on purpose." He looked at her. "I'm not vain about my appearance," she said carefully. "I'm aware of it the way you're aware of something you didn't ask for. Men have been making decisions about me based on how I look since I was 15 years old. The man I was engaged to at 23, she stopped, restarted. He wanted me on his arm. He didn't want me at the table. When I had opinions about the farm operation or the accounts, he found it unsettling." She looked at Gideon directly. "When the agency sent your letter to me, the specific request you made, I thought, here is a man who has disqualified the one thing that has always disqualified me." The lamp flame moved slightly in a draft from the window. "So you hit it," he said. "I let the photograph be what it was. I didn't lie about anything." A pause. "I did wonder if you'd send me back when you saw me." "I thought about it," he said honestly. "I know." A beat. "You looked like you were calculating something." "I was." "What did you calculate?" He looked at her for a moment. "That you'd already fixed the water trough, and I'd have been an idiot," he said. She laughed. That same brief, unguarded sound, and the tightness in his chest that he'd been carefully ignoring all month loosened in a way that alarmed him considerably. He picked up his pen and went back to the accounts. She went back to her letter. But the room felt different after that. Lighter, in some way he couldn't have put numbers to, and he sat in it until the lamp needed trimming and didn't want the evening to end. He went to bed uneasy in a way that had nothing to do with the ranch. By the end of April, the north fence line was replaced. The east trough was patched and functioning. The records were accurate. The storage corner was organized. The grain moisture problem had been identified as a cracked board in the northwest wall of the storage building, which they had repaired together on a Saturday afternoon that Gideon found himself remembering afterward with a vividness that the task itself did not warrant. The ranch looked different, not transformed. It was still a working operation with all the accumulated wear of a working operation, but tighter, more intentional, like a thing that was being paid attention to. Gideon had been paying attention to the ranch for 20 years, and it had not looked this way before. He knew why. He was sitting on the porch one evening in late April, watching the light go off the south pasture, and Rosalind came out with a cup of coffee and handed it to him without being asked, and sat down in the other chair. And the fact that she'd known, without asking, that he'd want coffee, and had made 2 cups rather than 1, sat in his chest alongside all the other things he was carefully not examining. "Spring stock count tomorrow," she said. "Early start," he agreed. A pause. The light on the pasture going gold, then orange, then the first faint purple of evening. "You know," she said quietly, "this is a good piece of land." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "It's got good bones. Whatever your father built here, it's solid underneath." She was looking at the pasture, not at him. "I think it could be something considerable in 10 years. He had thought this himself, at different points, in the way you think things when you're alone, and the thinking doesn't quite solidify into intention. Hearing it from her, stated plainly as though it was simply observed fact, made it feel more real than it had in years. "In 10 years, he said, "if it's managed right, a beat." "Which it will be." She said it without particular emphasis. No performance in it, just the matter-of-fact assurance of someone who had looked at a situation and made a determination. He looked at the pasture. He thought about the letter he'd written 4 months ago, the request he'd been half ashamed of since the moment he'd sent it. "I require a woman who will not be restless, who will not be looking elsewhere." He had been so certain he'd been solving for the right variable. "Rosalind," he said. She looked at him. He didn't have the words yet for what he wanted to say. He wasn't sure he'd have them for a while. "Thank you," he said, "for the coffee." A small pause. Something shifted in her expression, very briefly. Recognition, maybe, of the thing he wasn't saying yet, and the patience to let it stay unsaid. "Any time," she said. They sat on the porch until the light was gone entirely and the stars came out over the Nebraska plain, and neither of them spoke much more. And it was the most peaceful Gideon Mercer had felt in 9 years. He didn't know yet what to do with that. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. May arrived the way it usually did in Nebraska territory. Not gradually, but in a rush, like the land had been holding its breath all winter and finally let go. The grass came back in the north pasture faster than Gideon expected, and he found himself recalculating the grazing rotation he'd been running for 6 years, because Rosalind had pointed out during the spring stock count that he was overusing the southeast section and giving the northwest insufficient recovery time. "You'll have a bare patch by August if you keep the current rotation," she'd said, crouched down and pressing her fingers into the soil near the fence line, reading it the way some people read a face. "I've run it this way for years," he said, not argumentatively, just stating a fact. "I know, the southeast shows it." She stood up, brushed her hands on her skirt. "Shift the main herd north for 6 weeks starting now. Let the southeast rest. You'll see the difference by midsummer." He'd shifted the herd north. He didn't tell her he'd done it. She didn't mention that she'd noticed. But 2 weeks later, looking at the southeast pasture already beginning to recover, he understood that she'd been right in the way she was usually right. Not through guessing, but through actually looking at things. This was the part that Gideon was still adjusting to. Not the competence, he'd recognized that within the first week, but the specific experience of sharing a place with someone who saw it as clearly as he did, and sometimes more clearly. He'd been alone on this land for so long that his own perspective had become the only one he had access to. There was something disorienting about having that changed. Something disorienting, and something else that he was less willing to name. They'd settled into a working partnership that required almost no negotiation. She took the household accounts and the supply management. He handled the livestock decisions and the relationship with the hands, though she sat in on the conversations when she was available, and the two men he'd hired in late April, a quiet, steady older man named Birch and a younger one called Tate, who was 22 and energetic in the way of people who haven't yet been worn down. Both addressed their work questions to whichever one of them was closest, without apparent preference. This, too, was an adjustment. Gideon had been the sole authority on this land for 12 years. He realized now he'd unconsciously expected, that Rosalind would defer to him on the operations side, take the house, and leave the ranch to him. Instead, she'd simply moved into the full scope of things, taking what she was best suited for and leaving the rest, and the result was that the operation ran better than it had since before his father died. He wasn't sure what to do with that either. What he did mostly was work. There was enough of it. The problem that found them in early May started small, the way the worst problems usually do. Gideon came in from the east pasture on a Tuesday afternoon to find Rosalind in the yard talking to a man he didn't recognize, well-dressed for a ranch call, with a horse that was too good for casual visiting, and the particular ease of a man who was accustomed to being received well. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, handsome face and the kind of salt and pepper at his temples that some men wore better than they deserved to. He was talking to Rosalind with what Gideon's eye read, before he'd consciously formed an opinion about it, as more than neighborly interest. Rosalind's posture, by contrast, was the same as it was when she was working. Straight, direct, nothing yielding in it. Gideon came across the yard. The man turned to him with the easy confidence of someone extending an introduction and said his name was Harlan Cross, that he ran the cross operation about 12 miles north, and that he'd been meaning to come by and welcome the new, he paused very slightly, Mrs. Mercer to the county. Heard good things, Cross said, with a nod toward Rosalind that included a smile she hadn't returned. Quite a few good things, actually. County talks, Gideon said. It does. Cross looked around the yard, at the repaired fence posts, the organized outbuildings, the general look of a property that was being actively tended. You've done considerable work in a short time. We have, Gideon said. The we was deliberate. Cross heard it, a fractional adjustment in his expression, and then extended his hand with the continued ease of a man who didn't rattle easily. I'll let you get back to it, Cross said, after another few minutes of conversation that accomplished nothing. He tipped his hat to Rosalind with a particular attention that Gideon did not like. Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Cross, she said in a tone that could not be described as warm. They watched him ride out. When the sound of the horse had faded, Rosalind said, He's been by before. Gideon looked at her. Before today? Once, 2 weeks ago. You were at the south fence. She was watching the road with a flat expression. He wanted to discuss a water rights question on the north property line, except it turned out there wasn't actually a water rights question. What was there? An excuse to introduce himself and stand in my yard. She turned and went back toward the house. I expect he'll try again. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment after she'd gone inside. The tightness in his chest was back, specific and unignorable. He did not think about what that meant. He went to the barn and did an hour of work that he'd already done that morning. Cross did come back. Not the following week, but the one after. A Saturday, in the late afternoon, with a covered dish from his housekeeper as a pretext. He was charming in the practiced way of a man who knew how to be charming, and he brought up 3 different pieces of county business that were legitimate enough to justify a conversation, and Gideon sat through it at his own kitchen table with a careful neutrality that cost him more effort than any physical work he'd done that month. Rosalind was present for most of it, making coffee and contributing to the county business questions with her usual directness, and Cross listened to her with the attentive enthusiasm of someone who was performing interest in what she was saying while actually just enjoying watching her say it. After he left, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. He's not a bad man, Rosalind said, rinsing the cups. He's just persistent. Men like that usually are, Gideon said. She looked at him over her shoulder, something in her expression, briefly. Men like what, exactly? He didn't have a clean answer for that. Men who go after what they want without worrying too much about the existing situation. She was quiet for a moment, drying the cups. And what is the existing situation, in your view? It was a direct question, delivered without sharpness, but also without room to slide past it. This was her way. She didn't attack a thing, she just blocked the exits until you had to look at it. Gideon looked at the table. "We haven't formalized anything," he said. "We've been living here together for 6 weeks without a formal arrangement, yes." She set the cups down. "Is that what you want to keep doing?" He looked up at her. The lamplight in the kitchen. Her gray eyes, patient and unsentimental, waiting for him to catch up to something she'd probably identified 2 weeks ago. "No," he said. "What do you want to do?" The word marry was in the room without being said. They both knew it. He'd known it was coming since the evening on the porch with the coffee and the stars, had been circling it the way you circle a thing you want and don't trust yourself to want. "I want to ask you something," he said, "but I want to ask it right. You don't need to make it elaborate." "I know, He stopped, looked at her. "I need you to know it's not the ranch I'm asking about. There's enough of that already." Something shifted in her face, not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic person, but something real and unguarded that he only got a glimpse of before she composed it. "All right," she said. "Would you—" He started over. "Rosalind, will you marry me? Not because the situation requires it, because I want you to be my wife." The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said, simply, directly, with the exact same plain-spoken quality she brought to everything else. "I will." He nodded. She nodded. It was the least romantic proposal in the history of the Nebraska Territory, and neither of them cared even a little. They were married 3 weeks later in Calhoun County, a short civil ceremony with Ott as a witness and Mrs. Pickard as the other, and afterward there was a dinner at the Pickard house that Gideon found more exhausting than a full day of fence work, but endured because Rosalind seemed to find it quietly funny, and he'd started to realize that making her find things quietly funny was something he was actively interested in doing. That night, riding back to the ranch in the wagon, she sat beside him in the dark, and he was aware of her arm against his and the warmth of it through his coat sleeve, and neither of them said much, and the stars were extraordinary over the flat country. And Gideon Mercer, who had been certain for 9 years that he was done with this particular kind of feeling, found that he was not done with it at all. He was, in fact, only beginning. The summer that followed was the hardest and best work of Gideon's life. Not because of any single dramatic event. Summer on the frontier rarely had the courtesy of organizing itself into clear crises, but because of the sustained, grinding, daily nature of running a ranch in a dry year, which 1881 proved to be. June came in warm and stayed that way. By mid-July, the northwest pasture was showing stress, and the creek level had dropped enough that he was tracking it weekly. 3 of the cattle he'd picked up in a spring trade turned out to be carrying something that spread through the near pasture before Birch caught it, and they lost 2 head and had to isolate 6 others for nearly a month. Through all of it, Rosalind was there. Not in any sentimental way. There was nothing sentimental about Rosalind's approach to a problem, but in the fundamental, weight-bearing way of a person who saw what needed doing and did it without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement. She managed the isolation protocol on the sick cattle with a thoroughness that Gideon suspected most veterinary men would have found impressive. She reorganized the water management to compensate for the lower creek levels, routing supplemental water from the well system to the east trough and adjusting the herd movement to keep the animals from stressing the driest sections of pasture. She also kept the books with a rigor that Gideon had never applied to them himself. In late July, she put a ledger in front of him after dinner and showed him, without commentary, what the changes she'd made to the supply management and livestock rotation had saved in the first 3 months. He looked at the numbers for a long time. "That's real," he said. "I don't put things in ledgers that aren't real." He leaned back. "If we applied this to the north section, the rotation adjustment." "I already calculated it." She turned a page. "Here." He looked at her. "You knew I'd ask." "You always ask the next logical question." A very slight smile. "It's one of your better qualities." He wasn't sure what to do with that exactly. He looked back at the ledger. "We could buy the Tillman parcel," he said. "The 60 acres to the northeast. He's been wanting to sell for 2 years." "I know. I talked to Mrs. Tillman at the dry goods last week." She looked at the figures. "If we hold the current line through fall, we can make the offer in November." Gideon had wanted that parcel for 4 years. He had been unable to see his way to it alone. He sat looking at the numbers and feeling something large and slightly overwhelming that he had no precise word for. Gratitude didn't cover it, admiration didn't cover it, and love, which was the word his mind was circling with increasing frequency, was a thing he was still cautious about, because caution was built into him at a level that didn't change quickly. But he knew what he felt. He'd known for a while. What he hadn't done was say it. There was a version of Gideon Mercer who would have left it unsaid indefinitely. Not from coldness, but from the old habit of not putting himself in a position to be answered in a way he couldn't recover from. Margaret Hollis had cured him of a lot of things. The willingness to say the important thing out loud was one of the casualties. He was starting to think that was something he needed to fix. It was a Saturday in August, the kind of day that settled over the plains like a hot weight, everything still in the midday heat, when the occasion arrived unexpectedly. They'd been working since early morning on a section of the barn roof that had developed a problem. 2 boards rotted through from the winter, which they'd known about and kept putting off. Gideon was up on the roof, Rosalind below, passing materials up when he needed them and managing the ladder. And the work was going well enough, but the heat was punishing, and by early afternoon he was working in his shirt sleeves, and she had rolled her sleeves up and her hair had come half loose from its pins. And she looked, he thought, from his elevation on the roof, the way a person looks when they've stopped performing anything and are just simply there, present and real and entirely themselves. He came down the ladder at mid-afternoon for water. She handed him a tin cup and he drank half of it and stood in the narrow shade of the barn wall. "Rosalind," he said. She was looking at the remaining boards, calculating. I need to say something." She looked at him then, read whatever was in his face. "All right. I'm not good at this," he said. "I know that. I know I'm—" He stopped, organized it. "I've been holding myself at a distance from you. I want you to know that I'm aware of it, and I'm aware of why, and it's not about you." She was quiet, waiting. "It's about the fact that I got badly wrong once," he said, "and I spent 9 years constructing a set of rules to avoid being wrong again, and those rules were—" He paused. "They were small. They were a small man's answer to a painful thing. And you are nothing like what I was trying to protect myself from. And I think I've probably made you feel—" "You haven't made me feel unwanted," she said, "if that's what you're trying to get to." "That's not all I'm trying to get to." She looked at him steadily. "I love you," he said. "I've known it for a while. I just needed to say it out loud where it could be heard." The August heat, the barn, the half-finished roof, the smell of old wood and dry grass, all of it sitting around them, ordinary and unglamorous, which was exactly the right setting for 2 people like this. Rosalind looked at him for a long moment with those clear gray eyes. Then she said, "I know you do," quietly and simply, and without any particular performance. "I've been waiting for you to figure out you could say it." "How long?" She almost smiled. "June." He laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised him. And she did smile then, fully and without reserve, and it was the best thing he'd seen in years. He put his hand along her face, and she leaned into it briefly, and then she looked back at the barn roof with a practical expression. "We still have 4 boards to go," she said. "I know. I'll hold the ladder." He went back up, but the afternoon felt different after that, lighter, easier, the heat less punishing somehow. And when they finished the roof in the early evening and stood back to look at it, neither of them said anything, but she stood close enough that their arms were touching, and neither of them moved away, and Gideon thought, this is what I almost refused. This exact thing. The thought sat in him like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in all directions. He had almost refused it. He had written a letter designed to prevent it. He had been so certain that he was making the wise choice, the safe choice, that he had nearly constructed a life carefully sealed against the possibility of this. And the thing of it was, the frightening and clarifying thing of it was, that none of his rules had actually protected him. The woman standing beside him in the late August light, her hair coming loose and her sleeves still rolled and her face showing the honest tiredness of a full day's work, she had walked right past every wall he'd built, not by being what he'd feared, but by being something he'd never accounted for. Someone who stayed because she chose to, not because she had nowhere better to go. He didn't say any of this out loud. He didn't need to. She would have already thought it. They walked back to the house together in the cooling evening, and there was a quality to that walk. The ordinary details of it, the creak of the porch boards, the smell of the supper she'd started that morning in the Dutch oven, the way the lamp came on inside like a small answer, that Gideon Mercer would carry for the rest of his life. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't, because it was simply fully real, and he was in it, and so was she, and the ranch spread out around them in the last light like something that was only now becoming what it was always supposed to be. The Tillman parcel came through in November, exactly as Rosalind had calculated. Gideon made the offer on a Thursday, and Old Man Tillman accepted it by Saturday, which suggested he'd been waiting longer than he'd let on. The 60 acres to the northeast added a section of bottomland that held moisture better than anything Gideon currently ran, and a secondary water source, a shallow seasonal creek, that would matter considerably in dry years like the one they'd just survived. He'd wanted it for 4 years. Standing at the boundary line with Rosalind the morning after the papers were signed, looking at the new extent of what was now the Mercer Ranch, he felt something he recognized as satisfaction, but deeper than that. The specific feeling of a thing becoming more than it was. "The bottomland needs a season to recover," Rosalind said, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth at the creek margin. "Tillman ran too many head on it, but by next fall it'll carry 30 additional cattle without strain." "You've already worked the numbers." "Last week." She looked at the tree line to the north. "We'll need to extend the east fence line by about a quarter mile, and the water access needs a trough. Otherwise we'll have animals pushing to the creek bank and eroding it." "Spring project," he said. "Spring project," she agreed. He looked at her, looking at the land, assessing it, planning it, already seeing what it would be rather than only what it was, and felt the same thing he'd been feeling since August, which was a kind of quiet astonishment that he had almost, through his own stubborn fear, prevented this from existing at all. He didn't say that out loud. He'd said the important things in August, and she'd received them and returned them, and they'd moved forward together without needing to make a ceremony of it. That was how they were. He was grateful for it. What came next, neither of them planned for. The winter of 1881 arrived early. The first real cold came in mid-November, which wasn't unusual, but by the first week of December the temperature had dropped below zero and stayed there, and the sky had taken on the particular flat gray color that old-timers in the territory read as a warning. Gideon had seen bad winters. He'd survived the hard winter of 1875 alone on this ranch, when the temperature had gone to 30 below, and he'd lost 11 cattle and nearly lost 2 fingers on his right hand to frostbite. He knew the signs. He spent the first 2 weeks of December preparing with a thoroughness that even Rosalind noted. "You're worried," she said one evening, watching him inventory the hay stores for the 3rd time. "I'm cautious," he said. "Those are different things for most people. For you, they look the same." She was reviewing the supply ledger at the kitchen table, and she looked up at him. "What are you expecting?" "A hard one," he said. "The sky's been wrong since November." She didn't argue with this or ask him to explain what wrong meant about a sky. She looked back at the ledger and said, "We're short on lamp oil if we're looking at extended indoor time. I'll add it to Thursday's order." "Add extra," he said. She added extra. The blizzard came on a Thursday night in the 2nd week of December. It didn't announce itself dramatically. The afternoon had been still and cold, the light going early the way it did in deep winter, and Gideon had done the evening chores with a particular attention. Double-checked that the cattle in the near pasture had adequate windbreak access, made sure the barn was properly secured, brought the 2 horses that were showing any fragility into the interior stalls. By the time he came in for supper, the wind had begun to pick up from the northwest. By 8 o'clock it was a full storm. The sound of it against the house was something you felt in your sternum. Not the howl of an ordinary winter wind, but the sustained, grinding roar of a blizzard that meant business, the kind that packed hard ice crystals horizontally and reduced visibility to nothing within 20 feet. Gideon stood at the window and could see the lamp in the barn, which he'd left burning, and nothing else. Just white and darkness. "Temperature's dropping fast," he said. Rosalind was at the stove. "How fast?" "Fast enough." He turned from the window. "I need to go check on the cattle in the lower pasture. The windbreak there isn't—" "I know. I was thinking the same thing." She was already reaching for her coat. "You don't need to come." She looked at him with the flat expression she used when she found something he'd said not worth the effort of arguing about. She put her coat on, then her second coat on top of it. He didn't say anything else about it. They went out together, roped to each other, and to the line Gideon had strung from the house to the barn specifically for this kind of night. A precaution he'd added in October that Rosalind had questioned at the time and not questioned again after he'd explained the 1875 winter. The cold hit like a physical thing, not gradually, but all at once. The wind driving ice against any exposed skin, and the temperature so far below zero that breathing required a conscious effort. The cattle in the near pasture were managing. The windbreak was holding. He counted heads twice in the lantern light, found them all, and would have turned back to the house, except that was when he heard it. The particular sound of an animal in serious distress, carrying even above the wind from the direction of the calving shed on the east side of the barn. He knew immediately what it was. He'd been monitoring the condition of the herd's pregnant cattle for 2 weeks, and there was one heifer, a roan, young, her first calf, that had been showing signs he'd hoped would hold until January. In this cold, in this storm, a difficult birth would be a death sentence for both animals without intervention. "Calving shed," he said to Rosalind, close to her ear so the wind wouldn't take it. She nodded. The shed was a partial structure on the east side of the barn. 3 walls, a roof, open on the south side because it was used primarily in spring and fall. In this storm, the open south face was channeling wind directly in, and the temperature inside was only marginally better than outside. The heifer was down on her side in the far corner, and the situation was exactly what Gideon had feared. The calf was positioned wrong. He could see that immediately. And the animal was exhausted, had probably been laboring for hours before the sounds became audible. "She's been at this a while," Rosalind said, crouching beside the animal, her hand moving with a competence that Gideon noted distantly, while his mind was already calculating what needed to happen. "Calf's turned," he said. "I need to reposition it. I need both hands free, and I need to see what I'm doing." "I have the lantern," she said. What happened over the next 50 minutes was not the kind of thing that made for a clean story. It was cold and difficult and physical, and several moments went badly before they went better. Gideon worked with his coat off in sub-zero temperatures because the work required mobility and bare hands for feeling what he couldn't see, and the cold went into him like something with intent, his fingers losing sensation and then finding it again in a way that hurt considerably more than the losing. The heifer was frightened and uncooperative in the way of an animal in pain, and twice she rolled in a way that nearly knocked him over. And the second time he went down on one knee in the straw and came up with his trousers soaked through and the cold from the ground moving straight into his joints. Through all of it, Rosalind held the lantern. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Holding a lantern steady in a blizzard wind, in a 3-walled shed, for 50 minutes with the temperature at somewhere between 20 and 30 below zero, required a physical endurance and a mental steadiness that Gideon was only able to appreciate afterward, because at the time he was entirely occupied with the work in front of him. What he was aware of, in the way you're aware of things that are keeping you alive, was the light, consistent, correctly positioned, moving when he needed it to move, and staying still when he needed it still, as if the person holding it could read exactly what he needed without being told. She didn't speak. She didn't complain. When the wind gusted hard enough to stagger her, he could hear her recover her footing, and the light would waver for just a moment and then be steady again. The calf came at the 45th minute. Gideon pulled it clear, and it hit the straw and didn't move, and his stomach dropped. And then it moved, and the heifer turned her head toward it with that ancient instinct, and Gideon sat back on his heels in the straw with his arms aching and his hands not fully attached to him in any sensory sense, and breathed. "Alive?" Rosalind said. "Alive," he said. She lowered the lantern, and that was when he saw her hands. She'd been wearing her work gloves, but the sustained exposure, 50 minutes of holding a metal lantern in conditions that temperature, had gone through them. Her fingers were white at the tips in the way that was not good, and she was holding the lantern with a grip that suggested the hands were not fully cooperating, but she was making them cooperate by will alone. Rosalind. He was on his feet, crossing to her in 2 steps, taking the lantern from her and setting it down and taking her hands in both of his, which were not warm, were barely functional themselves, but were better than hers. "Why didn't you say something?" "You needed the light," she said. Her voice was steady, which aggravated him considerably. "You couldn't feel your hands." "Not for the last 15 minutes, no." "Why?" He stopped, because he knew why. Because she'd looked at the situation and made the calculation that the calf and the heifer needed the light more than she needed to mention that she was being frostbitten, because that was how she thought. He pulled her back toward the barn, into the interior where the body heat of the animals had kept the temperature above zero, and got her hands between his and worked at them with a steady pressure, and she made a sound when the feeling began to return that she tried to contain and didn't quite manage. "I know," he said. "Keep breathing." "I'm breathing," she said, a little sharply, which told him the pain was considerable. "You should have told me." "And you would have stopped. I would have figured something else out." There wasn't something else to figure out. She looked at him directly, her eyes watering slightly from the pain of circulation returning, which she was clearly finding embarrassing. The calf needed the light, and you needed both hands. That was the situation. That's not— He stopped, because arguing the point while her hands were still in his felt like the wrong priority. He kept working at them. "Are they going to be all right?" she asked, after a moment. Back to practical. Already past the rest of it. He looked at the tips of her fingers. The white was giving way to an angry red, which was the right progression. "I think so. You'll have some pain for a few days. The tips may blister." He looked up at her. "You need to be inside and warm for the rest of the night." "The cattle— Birch is in the bunkhouse. I'll get him to cover the night check." He looked at her. "You're going inside, Rosalind." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said, with the particular quality she used when she was conceding a point without conceding the principle behind it. "But check on the calf before you come in." "I will." "And the heifer. She'll need water in an hour once she's—" "I know how to manage a heifer after calving," he said. "I've been doing this since before you were writing letters to matrimonial agencies." She almost smiled. Almost. Her hands were shaking now from the returning circulation, and she was holding them against her chest and looking determinedly unbothered, which was such a complete and total expression of who she was that Gideon felt something so large and complicated move through him that he couldn't speak for a moment. He walked her back to the house through the blizzard, both of them on the guide rope, bent into the wind, and got her inside and her outer layers off and her hands wrapped and situated near the stove, and she sat in the kitchen chair with the focused stillness of someone managing considerable discomfort and not wanting to perform it. He got the kettle on and then stood in the middle of his own kitchen, looking at her. "Stop looking at me like that," she said, without opening her eyes. "Like what?" "Like you're trying to decide whether to apologize for something." He wasn't trying to decide that. He was trying to decide something else, and it was harder to find the right words for it than the thing he'd said in August had been. In August, it had been straightforward. This was a different kind of thing. "I watched you stand in that shed for 50 minutes, he said. "In conditions that were— I've been in conditions like that. I know what that costs." "The calf is alive," she said. "That's not the point I'm making." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I built my whole plan," he said, "around finding a woman who had nowhere better to go. That was my reasoning. That was what I told myself was smart." He stopped. "I was trying to guarantee something you can't guarantee. I was trying to buy loyalty by eliminating alternatives." He looked at her. "And instead, I got someone who stayed in a freezing shed with frostbitten hands because she decided that was what the situation needed. Not because she had to, because she chose to." The kitchen was quiet except for the storm against the walls and the kettle beginning to tick on the stove. "You chose it too," she said. "You went out there knowing it was going to be bad." "That's my ranch." "It's our ranch," she said, quietly, but with a precision that went straight through him. He looked at her for a long moment. He crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of her chair so they were at the same level, and he took her wrapped hands very carefully in his. "I know," he said. "I know it is." She looked at him with those gray eyes, a little tired, a little pained, entirely herself. "We'll need to check on them again in an hour. Birch will do it. Birch has never managed a first calf heifer alone. I'll go with him." "Good." She leaned her head back against the chair. "Make the tea strong. My hands are terrible." He made the tea strong. He sat across from her while the storm hammered the outside of the house, and they didn't talk much. And the calf was alive in the shed, and the fire was going in the stove, and outside the blizzard was doing its worst to the Nebraska territory with the indifference of something that doesn't know it's being survived. Inside, the lamp was lit and the tea was hot, and Rosalind had her eyes closed against the pain in her hands and was breathing with the deliberate steadiness of someone who was not going to make more of a thing than it needed to be made. Gideon sat with her through it. He thought about the letter he'd written in February, the calculation he'd made, the specific fear that had shaped the request, and the specific woman the request had brought him, and the particular distance between what he'd been trying to construct and what had actually arrived on his doorstep. He'd been trying to find safety. He hadn't known then that what he actually needed was someone brave enough to stand beside him in the dark. The storm lasted through Friday and into Saturday morning, then broke the way blizzards on the plains broke. Suddenly, almost apologetically, the wind dropping and the sky clearing to a blue so sharp it hurt to look at. The temperature was still brutal, but the flat, directionless quality of a blizzard morning was gone, and you could see the land again. Gideon walked the property in the early Saturday light and took stock. 3 fence sections in the north had gone down under the weight of drifted snow. The trough in the east pasture was frozen solid, which he'd expected. 2 cattle had pushed through the compromised windbreak section and needed to be retrieved from the Tillman bottomland, which was undignified for everyone involved. The barn roof had held, which was what mattered. The roan heifer was on her feet when he checked, the calf nursing with the slightly aggressive determination of a new animal that had survived a bad entry into the world and seemed to know it. Gideon stood watching them for a while, his breath making clouds in the cold barn air. He thought about what Rosalind had said. "It's our ranch." 2 words. But the weight of them had been settling into him since last night, rearranging things, and by this blue and frozen Saturday morning, he understood something that felt both obvious and large. She hadn't come to help him run his ranch. She'd come to build something with him. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a hired hand and a partner, and he had been slower than he should have been, to see it clearly. He walked back to the house. She was at the kitchen table with her hands still bandaged, the ledger open in front of her, making notes with a pencil held slightly awkwardly in fingers that were clearly still sore. "You should be resting those," he said. "I'm barely using them." "That's a ledger." "I'm writing with 2 fingers." She looked up. "How bad is it out there?" "Manageable. 3 fence sections in the north. Trough in the east is solid. 2 of the Haverford cattle are on our bottomland. Birch can get the cattle. I'll see if Tate can start on the north fence today if it warms enough by noon." "It might." She looked back at her ledger. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at her. The bandaged hands, the pencil held carefully, the absolute matter-of-fact quality of a person who had spent the night in considerable pain and was now doing the ranch accounts. "Rosalind," he said. She looked up. "The calf's a bull," he said. "Good size. Going to be worth something in 2 years." She looked at him for a moment. "Worth going out in the blizzard for, then?" "Worth going out in the blizzard for," he agreed. She nodded, a small, satisfied motion, and went back to the ledger. He went to the stove and put the kettle on, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a long, pale rectangle, and outside the Nebraska plains were white and still and cold and quietly, indifferently beautiful, and inside the Mercer Ranch was already, before 8 in the morning, calculating what came next. The frostbite on Rosalind's hands healed slowly, the way cold injuries always did, not in a clean progression, but in fits, some days better and some days worse, the tips of her fingers cycling between pain and numbness for nearly 3 weeks before she stopped mentioning it. She didn't complain. Gideon noticed because he'd started noticing everything, and he did what he could. Took the heavier outdoor work himself, made sure the kitchen stayed warmer than he'd ever bothered keeping it for his own sake, brought in extra wood without being asked so she wouldn't have to. She noticed him doing these things the way she noticed most things, completely, and without making a production of it. "You don't have to manage around me," she said, one morning in late December, watching him stack a second load of wood beside the stove when the first was already adequate. "I'm not managing around you," he said. "I'm keeping the kitchen warm." "You've never kept it this warm in your life. I've seen your breath in here in November." He didn't argue the point. He put the last log down and went back outside. She let it go. That was one of the things he'd come to rely on without quite acknowledging it. Her willingness to win a point and then leave it alone, not extract anything further from it. The new year came without ceremony. January on the plains was survival by definition. You got through it. You kept the animals alive. You did the maintenance that couldn't wait and deferred everything that could. The bull calf from the blizzard night, whom Tate had started calling Lazarus in a moment of humor that had inexplicably stuck, was thriving. His mother had turned into a reliable producer and would earn her place in the permanent herd. Small returns. They added up. By February, Rosalind's hands were fully healed and the ranch was functioning with the quiet efficiency that had become, over these months, simply the way things were. Gideon had stopped marveling at it and started trusting it, which he understood was a different and more significant thing. It was also in February that the trouble with the water rights arrived. It started as a letter. Most trouble in the territory started as a letter because the men who created trouble from a distance preferred the instrument to anything more direct. This one came from a land office in Omaha, addressed to Gideon, informing him in the careful language of legal correspondence that a claim had been filed disputing the Mercer Ranch's access to the creek running along the south pasture boundary. The claim was filed by a party identified as the Consolidated Grazing and Land Trust, and it asserted that the original survey of Gideon's father's property in 1857 had incorrectly recorded the creek as interior to the Mercer boundary when it was in fact a shared resource under territorial water law. Gideon read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Rosalind. She read it once, set it on the table, and was quiet for a moment. "Have you seen the original survey documents?" she asked. "They're in the county records office. My father filed them." "Have you personally read them?" He hadn't. He'd had no reason to. The creek had been part of his property for 24 years, and no one had ever disputed it. "We need to read them," she said. "This is Harlan Cross," Gideon said. He said it flatly, because he'd known it as soon as he'd read the name of the trust, and he didn't see the point of pretending otherwise. Rosalind looked at him. "Consolidated Grazing and Land Trust," he said. "Cross consolidated 3 properties under a holding trust last spring. Ott mentioned it at the time." He looked at the letter. "He's been trying to expand his water access for 2 years. The creek on our south boundary is the most reliable source-fed water within 6 miles of his northwest pasture. He can't just file a claim and take it. He can file a claim and make it expensive enough that smaller operations give up and settle." Gideon's jaw was tight. "He's done it before, twice that I know of, to operations north of his. One of them was the Garfield family. They sold out to him inside of a year." Rosalind was looking at the letter again with the expression she used when she was reading something several levels deeper than its surface. "He waited until winter," she said, "filed in the slow season when everything's harder to respond to." "Yes. And the timing, after last summer's drought year, when water access is front of mind for every operation in the county." She set the letter down. "He's not stupid." "No," Gideon said. "He's not." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "We need the survey documents," she said. "And we need someone who knows territorial water law. There's a land attorney in Fremont, Harker. He's the man people use for this kind of thing. Can we afford him?" It wasn't a challenge, just a question, asked the way she asked everything, directly and without sentiment. Gideon thought about the numbers. The Tillman purchase had been a stretch. The winter had been costly. The spring improvements they'd planned were already committed in terms of materials. "It'll be tight," he said. "Then we need to be efficient about it." She stood up and went to her account ledger on the sideboard. "Let me look at what we can defer without affecting operations." She opened it and began moving down the columns with her finger. "The east fence extension. That can wait until fall. The new trough can wait. The lumber for the calving shed expansion." She paused. "That one matters. But we can push it to late spring rather than early." "The fence extension can't go to fall," he said. "If we're running additional cattle on the Tillman parcel in summer, then we do it in late spring, before the summer rotation." She didn't look up from the ledger. "It's tight, but it works. That frees up enough to cover the attorney fees for at least the initial consultation and documentation phase." He watched her working through the numbers, shifting and adjusting with the particular speed of someone who understood the underlying structure of a thing well enough to move its parts without losing track of the whole. He thought, not for the first time, about what this operation would look like right now if he'd been running it alone, if he'd sent the Hartwell agency the letter and received no response, or received the response he'd actually asked for, some tired and beaten-down woman who'd have kept the house and stayed out of the accounts, and watched him navigate this with half the information he currently had. "Gideon," she said without looking up. "What?" "Stop thinking about how it would be if I weren't here. It's not useful, and I can tell when you're doing it." He stared at her. "How can you tell?" "You get a look." She turned a page in the ledger. "Write to the Fremont attorney today. I want to know what we're dealing with before Cross has a chance to move to the next step, whatever that is." He wrote the letter that afternoon. Parker, the Fremont attorney, was a compact, efficient man in his 50s who arrived at the ranch on a Thursday in early February with a leather case and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen variations of this situation many times. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to Gideon lay out the situation, and then he turned to Rosalind, who had the survey documents, the water records, and the original property filing arranged in a sequence on the table beside him, and spent 40 minutes going through them with her while Gideon sat across the table feeling the particular uselessness of a man who is not the most useful person in a conversation. Rosalind had obtained the original survey documents from the county records office herself. 3 days after the letter arrived, riding the 12 miles to the county seat in February cold that Gideon would have preferred she wait out. She'd returned with the documents and 2 pages of handwritten notes in her small, precise script. "The 1857 survey is imprecise in this section," Parker said, tapping a particular passage in the document. "The language here it's the language of the period, which wasn't always careful about watercourse boundaries. Cross's attorney will argue it creates ambiguity." "What does the 1868 county resurvey show?" Rosalind asked. She pushed a second document across the table. "This one. It was part of the Calhoun County boundary consolidation." Parker looked at it. His expression shifted fractionally. "The 1868 document is more specific," she said. "It identifies the creek as interior to the Mercer property boundary by survey pin reference. Those pins were set by the county surveyor and are recorded separately in the county land register." She placed a third document on the table. "I found the land register entry here." Parker looked at the 3 documents together. He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "where did you learn to navigate county land records?" "I kept books for a dry goods operation in Hannibal for 2 years," she said. "The owner had a land dispute with a neighboring property. I helped him find the documentation." She looked at Parker evenly. "Is it useful?" "It's extremely useful," he said. "The 1868 resurvey with the pin references essentially closes the ambiguity the 1857 language created. Cross's claim depends on that ambiguity. Without it, he doesn't have a case." Gideon looked at Rosalind. She was looking at the documents, not at him, but he could see the particular quality in her posture, the contained satisfaction of someone who had found the thing they were looking for. "He'll know this is coming," she said. "Once he sees we have competent representation, he'll look for another angle." "What angle?" Gideon asked. Parker and Rosalind looked at each other briefly. "He could dispute the 1868 resurvey itself," Parker said. "Challenge its methodology or the surveyor's authority. It's a weaker argument, but it prolongs the process." "Prolonging the process is his goal," Rosalind said. "Not winning in court. He wants us spending money until it's easier to settle. Then we make sure he understands early that we're not going to settle," Gideon said. Parker nodded slowly. "A strong initial response, comprehensive documentation filed promptly, sends that message more effectively than anything said directly." "File it," Gideon said. They filed the response within the week. Parker submitted the full document package: the 1857 survey, the 1868 resurvey with pin references, the county land register entries, and a legal brief that Gideon couldn't follow half of, but which Rosalind had reviewed line by line before signing off. And for 2 weeks they heard nothing. Then Cross rode over. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, alone this time, no housekeeper's dish, no county business pretext. He tied his horse at the fence and came up the yard with the particular bearing of a man who had made a calculation and wasn't happy with the result but wasn't going to show it. Gideon met him in the yard. Rosalind came out of the house and stood on the porch. "Gideon?" Cross said. "Harlan." Cross looked at him for a moment, then at Rosalind, then back. "I want to talk about the water claim." "Talk to Harker in Fremont," Gideon said. "That's what he's there for. I'm talking to you directly, man to man." Cross had that practiced ease, the smoothness of someone who negotiated by preference rather than confrontation. I think we got off on the wrong foot with this. It was my attorney's overreach, if I'm honest. He identified what he believed was an ambiguity and filed without my full understanding of the history. A pause. I'm prepared to withdraw the claim, in exchange for a water-sharing arrangement on the South Creek during drought conditions. Reasonable terms. Your operation retains full ownership. It was not a bad offer. Gideon could hear that it wasn't a bad offer. It was calibrated carefully, generous enough to sound reasonable, specific enough to have teeth in a drought year. He looked at Cross for a moment. Then he looked at Rosalind on the porch. Her expression was neutral. She wasn't signaling anything, and she wouldn't. She didn't manage him in front of other people. But he knew her well enough by now to read the quality of a neutrality. And this one was the kind that meant, "This is your call, but I have a view." "Come inside," Gideon said. They sat at the kitchen table. Cross took the chair across from both of them with the ease of a man at home in any room, and Gideon watched him take in the organized accounts on the sideboard, the survey documents still laid out on the corner table, the general evidence of a household that was being run with attention. "Tell me the specific terms," Rosalind said. Cross looked at her briefly. Not rudely. He was too practiced for that, but with the micro-adjustment of a man who had expected to be talking to the husband. "Water access rights during declared drought conditions," he said, "defined as county rainfall below 50% of seasonal average in any 30-day period. Access limited to the east tributary section, not the main creek run. Mercer retains full ownership and first right to the water. Cross operations draw only what's surplus." "Surplus is undefined," Rosalind said. "We'd define it in the agreement." "Who defines it at the time of a drought event? If there's a dispute about whether a given volume constitutes surplus, who arbitrates?" Cross paused, a slight one. "We could designate the county water board. The county water board has a 3-month response timeline under current territorial statute," she said. "That's not useful in an active drought. You'd need a specific volume threshold written into the agreement, or the arbitration clause is meaningless." Gideon sat very still. He was watching Cross make the adjustment that everyone made sooner or later when they were in a conversation with Rosalind and had come in assuming they were talking to someone else. "I can have my attorney draft specific volume language," Cross said. "Before or after you withdraw the claim?" she asked. A pause. "Simultaneously." "Simultaneously means the withdrawal is conditional on us accepting whatever language your attorney drafts," she said. "We'd need independent review of the volume terms before any withdrawal is made final." Cross looked at her for a long moment. The easy manner was still in place, but Gideon could see it was costing something now. "You've thought about this?" Cross said. "I think about things that affect this ranch," she said. "Yes." Cross looked at Gideon. "She's formidable," he said, with a tone that was somewhere between acknowledgement and concession. "I know," Gideon said. "Gideon," Rosalind said with a slight edge that meant she didn't particularly want to be discussed in the third person. "My apologies," Cross said to her, and to his credit, it sounded genuine. He leaned back slightly in the chair. "Here's where I am, honestly. My attorney identified what he believed was a legal exposure and filed. I won't pretend the water access wasn't attractive. It is, particularly after last summer. But I'm not trying to take something that's yours. What I want is a drought contingency that doesn't leave my Northwest operation dry in a bad year." "That's a different conversation than the one your attorney started," Gideon said. "I know it is." Cross met his eyes. "And I'm having the different one now." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Gideon looked at Rosalind. She gave him the very slight nod that meant, "I think he's being straight." "Withdraw the claim through Harker's office," Gideon said. "Clean withdrawal, no conditions. Then have your attorney contact Harker about a separate water access agreement with the specific terms Rosalind described. Volume thresholds, independent arbitration trigger, Mercer first right clearly stated." He paused. "If the terms are fair, we'll consider it." Cross nodded. "That's reasonable." "It is," Gideon agreed. "More reasonable than what you opened with." Cross stood, settled his coat, and extended his hand. Gideon shook it. Cross turned to Rosalind. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, with a directness that had none of the earlier studied quality. "You run a sharp operation here." "We do," she said. Not unkindly, just correctly. He left. They listened to his horse go down the road, and then the yard was quiet. Gideon sat with his hands on the table. He was going to run over us. He was going to try, she said. It's what he does. She pulled the account ledger back toward her. If his attorney drafts reasonable terms, the water access arrangement isn't a bad thing for us either. A formal agreement gives us more protection than the current situation, which is just ownership without documentation of historical use. You were already thinking about that, since the letter arrived. She opened the ledger. We also need to talk about the east fence extension. If we move the timeline up, Rosalind, she looked up. Stop for a minute, he said. She stopped. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The survey documents in the corner, the account ledger open, the February light coming through the window, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a working ranch that was, against reasonable odds and the particular stubbornness of one man's fear, becoming something considerable. When I wrote that letter, he said slowly, I was trying to find the one variable I could control. I couldn't control whether someone stayed or left, but I thought I could control whether they had reason to go. He shook his head. I was so certain I was being smart about it. She was quiet, watching him. You've stayed, he said. Not because you have nowhere better to go. You had options. Cross was one of them, and we both know it. He paused. You stayed because you chose to, and I need you to know I understand the difference, that it's not lost on me. Rosalind looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression that he'd learned to read, the private, unguarded quality that she allowed only in these specific moments when she judged it safe. I stayed because this is mine too, she said. The land and the work, and... She stopped briefly. You. Because you mean what you say and you say what you mean, and that is rarer than it should be. She looked back at the ledger, composing herself back into the practical. Also, the bottomland is excellent, and I refuse to let Harlan Cross have the water rights. He laughed. The real kind. And she smiled without looking up, and the afternoon settled around them with the comfortable, unspectacular quality of a life that was working the way it was supposed to work. Not perfect. The east fence still needed doing, and the attorney fees had created a tightness in the spring budget, and Tate had made an error with the livestock count that would require reconciling, and there were 100 other things pressing from every direction the way things always pressed on a working operation in the Nebraska territory. But Gideon sat at the kitchen table across from his wife and felt, with a clarity he hadn't possessed in years, that he was exactly where he'd chosen to be, not where circumstance had stranded him, not where fear had backed him into, but where two people had looked at each other clearly and decided, separately and together, that this was the thing worth building. That was enough. More than enough. Outside, the February plains were brown and cold and indifferent, and the creek on the south boundary ran on as it always had, belonging entirely to the Mercer Ranch, documented and defended and very much not going anywhere. Cross withdrew the water claim in March, as he'd said he would. Harker sent a brief note confirming it. 2 sentences. The efficient communication of a man who billed by the hour and didn't waste words outside of it. Gideon read it at the kitchen table and set it down and didn't say anything particular because there wasn't much to say. The claim had been filed and they'd answered it, and now it was done. That was how it was supposed to work. Rosalind was at the stove when he read it. She glanced at his face and understood what the letter contained without being told. Good, she said, and went back to what she was doing. The separate water access agreement took until May to negotiate. 3 drafts back and forth between Harker and Cross's attorney, 2 specific provisions that Rosalind rejected and had rewritten, 1 clause about drought threshold definition that she revised herself and sent back with a note that Harker described, with visible amusement, as the clearest legal language he'd encountered from a non-attorney in 30 years of practice. The final agreement was fair. Mercer Ranch retained full ownership and primary right. Cross operations could draw a defined volume from the east tributary during documented drought conditions only, with an independent volume arbiter named in the document. Any dispute defaulted to a specific resolution mechanism with a timeline that actually worked. It was, Rosalind noted when she signed it, better protection than they'd had before the claim was ever filed. He did us an accidental favor, she said. Don't tell him that, Gideon said. I wasn't planning to. Spring came in properly that year, not the grudging provisional spring of 1881, but a full one, the kind the territory occasionally offered as if in apology for its winters. The grass came back thick in the bottomland of the Tillman parcel, exactly as Rosalind had predicted it would after a recovery season. The east fence extension went up in April, a solid week of work with Gideon and Birch and Tate and Rosalind rotating through the labor, and when it was done, the expanded grazing rotation locked into place, and the Mercer herd spread across the new acreage as though it had always been there. Lazarus, the blizzard bull, was growing into something worth watching. He had the heavy chest and broad forehead of an animal that would set quality into whatever herd he serviced, and a temperament that was manageable without being dull. Gideon had started fielding questions about him from 2 other operations in the county. He told them the bull wasn't available yet, in 2 years, maybe. "You've named your future revenue stream after a resurrection story," Rosalind observed, the evening he mentioned this. Tate named him. "You kept the name." "It fits," he said. She had no argument against that. What Gideon noticed most about the spring of 1882 was not any single event, but the quality of the days themselves, the specific texture of a life that had found its shape. He'd known functional days before, days where the work was done and the operation held, but there was a difference between days that held together and days that had weight to them, and he was only now, at 38 years old, learning the difference from the inside. It had something to do with having someone to talk to at the end of them, not talk in the sense of performance. He'd never been good at conversation for its own sake, and Rosalind had no more patience for it than he did. But the specific thing of sitting across from a person at the end of a day's work and being able to say the east section is looking good, or I think Birch is planning to leave in the fall, or I made an error with the spring tally, and I need to recount, and have those things received by someone who understood their actual weight, someone who would push back when he was wrong, and agree when he was right, and occasionally tell him something he hadn't seen that changed how he understood the situation. He'd lived without that for 12 years. He hadn't known what he was missing because you can't fully understand the absence of something you've never had. The child came as news in June, announced by Rosalind with her characteristic lack of ceremony. She set his coffee in front of him one morning, sat down across from him, and said, "I'm pregnant. Probably November." Gideon looked at her. "You're not saying anything," she observed. "I'm taking it in," he said. "All right." He looked at her for another moment. There was the particular careful stillness in her face that meant she was managing her own response while waiting for his. She did this in high-stakes conversations, held herself level until she knew the ground. He understood now that this was not coldness. It was the habit of a woman who had learned early that showing her hand before she knew the table was a liability. "Are you well?" he asked. Something shifted in her expression. Relief, briefly visible. "Yes, so far. I'm tired in the mornings, that's all. Tell me if that changes." "I will." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, and that was the conversation. No speeches, no theater, just the 2 of them at the kitchen table in the June morning with the window open and the sound of the ranch starting up outside. He found, in the weeks that followed, that impending fatherhood did not sit in him the way he might have predicted. He'd have expected anxiety. Another variable, another thing that could go wrong. Instead, what he felt was something more like a deepening of the same thing he'd been feeling since August. An expansion. The ranch was already more than it had been when he'd been alone on it. This was more of that. More to protect, more to build toward, more reason to care whether the fence line held and the water ran and the numbers worked. He didn't know how to say that to Rosalind without it sounding like he valued the child for what it represented rather than what it was. So he didn't try to say it. He just came home earlier in the evenings, made sure the wood was stacked before she asked. Took the early morning barn check without discussion. She noticed all of it. She didn't mention it either. Their daughter was born in November in the farmhouse, a hard night and a longer morning. And when it was done and the county midwife had declared both mother and child in adequate condition and finally left them alone, Gideon sat on the edge of the bed looking at Rosalind holding an infant who was red-faced and expressing her opinions at volume, and felt something completely outside the range of anything he'd prepared for. "She's loud," he said, because it was the thing in front of him. She's mine, Rosalind said, which was not a correction, but a statement of fundamental fact. Then she looked up at him with tired eyes and a directness that even 12 hours of hard labor hadn't diminished. Ours, she said. Ours, he agreed. They named her Clara. She had Rosalind's eyes, that clear, unsentimental gray, and a temperament that announced itself early as her mother's. By 6 months, she was watching everything in a room with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. By 2 years, she was following Rosalind around the kitchen, demanding explanations for things, and Rosalind gave them seriously and completely, which Gideon suspected was the right approach. The second child, a boy, came in 1884. Thomas. He had Gideon's build and his grandmother's stubbornness, according to the limited evidence available at age 1, and cried less than his sister had and slept more, which everyone found a relief. The house felt different with 2 children in it, fuller, louder, more complicated, and Gideon moved through it with the adjusted awareness of a man learning to operate in changed conditions, which was, he supposed, what parenthood was. The ranch grew around all of this, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the compound effect of good decisions made consistently over time. The Tillman bottomland delivered what Rosalind had calculated it would. The expanded herd rotation improved the condition of the livestock across the board, which showed in the prices Gideon was able to command at market. Lazarus serviced his first external operation in the fall of 1883, and his reputation in the county spread the way reputation spread in that world, through visible results, through cattle that other ranchers looked at and asked about. In 1885, they bought another 40 acres to the east, a smaller parcel, less dramatic than the Tillman purchase, but it closed a gap in the property's boundary that had always bothered Gideon and gave them a direct access road to the county track that saved 2 miles of travel. Rosalind had identified the access road value 6 months before the parcel came available. She'd had the purchase price ready in the operating account when the owner, a widow named Harstad, decided to sell. You knew she was going to sell, Gideon said, the day they signed. I thought she might. Her son is in Kansas, and she's been at that property alone for 2 years. Rosalind put the signed documents in the household file. I kept the funds liquid, that's all. That's not all. She looked at him. You anticipated it and positioned for it, he said. 2 years ago, you'd have taken that money and put it against the fence costs. 2 years ago, we needed the fence more. She closed the file. The situation changes. You read the situation. He stood looking at her in the small county records office, in the particular unglamorous surroundings of a Tuesday morning land transaction, and thought about the letter he'd written in the winter of 1881 and what he'd been trying to buy with it. Safety. Certainty. The elimination of a risk he'd decided he couldn't survive. What he'd gotten instead was this woman who read situations 2 years in advance and kept purchase funds liquid and had stood in a blizzard shed for 50 minutes holding a lantern and hadn't mentioned her hands were freezing until the work was finished. Rosalind, he said. She looked up from the file. I want to tell you something I probably should have said more clearly before now. She waited. The records office clerk was at the far end of the room with his back to them, which was adequate privacy. I spent 9 years being wrong about what I needed, Gideon said. I thought I needed something small and safe. I thought that was wisdom. It wasn't wisdom. It was... He looked for the right word. It was fear dressed up as strategy. And I was so committed to it that I almost built the rest of my life around it. She was watching him with the quiet attention she gave to things that mattered. What I actually needed was someone who would show up to the hard part, he said, not because they were trapped or because they had no other option, but because they decided to. Because they looked at the situation and determined it was worth the effort. He paused. You've done that every day since you got off that train. I'm not sure I've ever told you that I see it. Rosalind looked at him for a moment. The records office, the filing clerk, the smell of old paper and ink, and the general unglamour of a Tuesday morning in a county seat in the Nebraska territory. You see it every time you come home earlier than you need to, she said, and every time you let me be right without making it a thing. And every time you look at a problem the hard way instead of the easy way because you know I'd rather work the problem than pretend it isn't there. She held his gaze. I see you seeing it. I have for a while. He nodded. She nodded. They walked out of the records office into the May morning and drove home through the green country. And if neither of them spoke much, it was not from absence, but from the particular fullness of two people who have said the necessary thing and don't need to ornament it. The years that followed had their difficulties, because years always do. And the frontier did not develop a gentler nature simply because the Mercer Ranch was doing well. There were hard summers and one devastating early frost in 1887 that took a portion of the season's yield and required a recalculation of the following year's plan. Birch left in the fall of 1885, as Gideon had predicted, and the man they hired to replace him turned out to be less reliable than advertised and had to be let go before winter, which created a difficult 3-month stretch with insufficient hands. Clara, at 6, fell from the fence rail in the north pasture and broke her arm in a way that required the county doctor and 4 weeks of management that Gideon found more difficult than any physical work he'd done, because he didn't know how to fix it, and that particular helplessness was not something he'd ever learned to carry well. Rosalind, in each of these situations, was steady in the way she'd always been steady. Not unaffected, not performing in vulnerability, but functional. She cried the night Clara came home with her arm set, briefly and privately, in the kitchen after the children were asleep. And Gideon sat with her and didn't try to manage it, just stayed. And when she was done, she straightened up and said, "I hate this." And he said, "I know." And that was enough. He'd gotten better at that, at staying in a hard moment instead of trying to work his way out of it. She'd taught him that, without intending to teach him anything, just by being someone who did it, consistently, so he could see what it looked like. The drought of 1890 was the worst of their years. The entire county suffered, and several operations that had been marginal went under. The Mercer Ranch did not go under. The water access agreement with Cross, the one that had come out of that February dispute, proved its value in a way that Cross, to his credit, honored without difficulty. The diversified grazing rotation that Rosalind had been refining for nearly a decade protected the pasture condition better than most neighboring operations managed. The reserves they'd maintained, the liquid accounts, the deliberate conservatism in the good years, all of it paid forward into the drought year in the form of survival. They came out of 1890 with the operation intact, and with 2 additional acres of bottomland they'd been able to purchase from a neighbor who hadn't managed the same. "That's not something I feel good about," Gideon said, the evening the Carver purchase closed. "A man loses his land, and we're the ones buying it." "I know," Rosalind said. She was quiet for a moment. Carver was offered fair price, and he took it. He would have lost it to the bank for less. She looked at her hands on the table. "You can feel bad about the situation without it meaning we did wrong. Is there a difference?" "There's always a difference between the situation and the decision made inside it." She looked at him. "We didn't cause the drought. We managed for it. That's not the same thing." He knew she was right. He sat with the discomfort of it anyway, because that was honest, and she didn't try to talk him out of it. She understood the difference between a thing that needed resolving and a thing that just needed sitting with. Clara was 12 by the time the century turned, and Thomas 10, and they had both grown into people who were recognizably their parents' children. Clara with her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that would either serve her extremely well or make her life considerably more difficult than necessary, and possibly both. Thomas with a quieter quality, more observational, slower to conclude, the kind of child who watched a situation from 3 angles before engaging it. Gideon recognized this as his own younger self and felt, watching his son, a complicated tenderness. They were both on the ranch from the time they could work, which was early. Rosalind had no patience for the idea that children should be kept from the operation that their lives depended on. Clara could read a grazing rotation by the time she was 8 and could do the supply accounts with minimal supervision by 11. Thomas was better with the animals than the numbers, which Gideon respected as its own kind of intelligence. One evening, in the fall of 1900, Gideon found himself sitting on the porch after dinner with the particular quality of stillness that came at the end of a day that had gone well. The ranch spread out in front of him in the low autumn light. The extended fence lines, the full pastures, the barn they'd expanded in 1893, the second outbuilding Rosalind had designed the layout for. 560 acres now, from the original 460. Not an empire, not the largest operation in the county, but solid, with good bones, and becoming something in the way that things become when they're given consistent attention over time. Rosalind came out and sat in the other chair, and he was aware of this without turning to look, because he'd been aware of her movements for nearly 20 years. Clara wants to manage the Eastern rotation herself next spring, Rosalind said. I know, she told me. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. She's ready. I know she is. He paused. He stopped, looked at the pasture. I just needed a day to feel old about it. She made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she permitted herself at dusk on a porch, which was quiet and very slightly warm. You're not old. 46. That's not old. It's old enough to notice when things are changing. The light was going off the south pasture in the way it did in fall, that long horizontal gold that made the grass look like something from a painting of the territory rather than the territory itself. He'd watched that light come and go for 30 years on this land, and it still did something to him. That was one of the things he hadn't expected about staying somewhere long enough, that ordinary things accrued meaning they didn't start with. I found the letter last week, he said. She turned her head toward him slightly. Which letter? The one I wrote to the agency. He looked at the pasture. The original draft. It was in the back of the ledger box, in the filing corner. I'd forgotten I'd kept the draft. She was quiet. I read it, he said. The whole thing. What I asked for. A pause. I want a wife who is plain, forgettable, and unlikely to leave. He said it from memory, which surprised him, that he still had it word for word. That's what I wrote. I know what you wrote, she said. The agency shared the original request when they sent me your file. He turned to look at her. They sent you the full request? They sent me everything. It was their practice. She was looking at the pasture. I read what you asked for, and I thought about it for 3 days before I wrote back. He hadn't known this. 20 years, and he hadn't known she'd had the full text of his request before she'd ever replied. What did you think? He said, when you read it. She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much to say. I thought you were a man in a lot of pain trying to solve it with a practical measure, she said. I thought that was either going to make you rigid and impossible, or it was going to mean that the right person could actually get through because you'd already cleared away the performance. She paused. I didn't know which one it would be. That's why I wrote back. He looked at her profile in the evening light. The gray that had come into her hair in the last few years, the lines at the corners of her eyes that weren't there in 1881, the same set of her jaw that had been the first thing he'd noticed on the platform, that quality of presence that no photograph had ever adequately captured. Forgettable, he said. The word from the letter. She almost smiled. I was an idiot, he said. You were scared, she said. There's a difference. Not much of one from where I was standing. Maybe not then. She looked at him. But there is, actually. An idiot doesn't change. A scared person can, if they decide to. She held his gaze in the way she did when she meant something precisely. You decided to. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the platform in the February cold, 20 years ago, the way she'd set her bags down and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, Mr. Mercer, with the particular composure of a woman who had made her calculation and was prepared for any version of the result. He thought about the porch in August, the barn roof in the heat, the blizzard shed, the kitchen table across from which she'd rearranged the way he understood most things. He thought about what his life would have been if he'd gotten what he asked for. The thought had no particular shape. He couldn't quite construct it, couldn't imagine the outline of days that would have accumulated in this house without her in them. He'd tried, sometimes, in the early years, tried to see the alternative clearly as a way of being grateful. He'd given it up eventually. The alternative wasn't a real thing. It was just the absence of everything that was. Rosalind, he said. Thank you for writing back. She looked at him, and the evening light was doing something to her face that it did sometimes, finding an angle that was nothing like the photograph from 1881 and everything like the woman he'd been sitting next to for 2 decades. And she said, Thank you for not sending me back when you saw me. He laughed, the real kind, the one that still surprised him sometimes. She smiled, fully, without reserve, the way she'd smiled that first evening in the kitchen over 20 years ago, the smile that had done something to the air in the room he'd never been able to account for, and still couldn't. They sat on the porch until the light was gone and the stars came out over the Nebraska plains, immense and indifferent and beautiful in the way of things that don't know they're being witnessed. Inside, Clara was arguing with Thomas about something audible through the window, and the lamp was on in the kitchen. And the ranch sat quiet in the fall dark, 560 acres of it, built up from 460 over 20 years of consistent, unspectacular daily work by two people who had started with almost nothing between them except honesty and the particular willingness to keep showing up. That was the whole of it, really. Gideon had spent a long time believing that love was a risk you managed by reducing it, that if you just controlled the variables carefully enough, removed the threats, selected for safety, you could have the warmth without the exposure. He knew now that this was not how it worked. The warmth was the exposure. You couldn't have one without accepting the other. The only real question was whether the person you were exposed to was worth it. He'd asked for forgettable. He'd gotten someone he would spend the rest of his life unable to adequately describe. He'd been afraid of beauty because he'd confused it with instability, confused the way a woman looked with what she was made of. He'd looked at Margaret Hollis leaving and concluded that the appearance was the danger, when the truth was simpler and harder. She'd left because she wanted to, and no amount of selecting for plain would protect you from someone who eventually wanted something different. The only protection was finding someone who chose to stay. Every day, choosing it. Not because they had to, because they decided to. Rosalind had decided to. And she'd kept deciding, through the drought years and the hard winters and the water rights dispute and the slow accumulation of ordinary days that were just ordinary days, work and weather and children and animals, and the 1,000 unremarkable problems of a life lived at close range with another imperfect person. That was what he had. Not a story of two people who were perfect for each other. A story of two people who were wrong in complementary ways and honest enough to say so, and who had decided separately and together that the building was worth more than the protection from its risk. The stars were very clear. Clara and Thomas had stopped arguing. The lamp in the kitchen was warm through the window. Rosalind's arm was against his in the chair, and neither of them moved away. And the ranch was quiet around them in the fall dark. And Gideon Mercer was, in the most uncomplicated and complete way, exactly where he'd chosen to be.